Colorado Territory. Winter 1887. The mountains kept their secrets the way certain men did. Without apology, without explanation, and long after you'd stopped thinking to ask, snow buried the unnamed trails. Wind came off the high peaks cold and direct, the kind that didn't negotiate. Somewhere behind the timber line, past ridges no surveyor had bothered to map, a valley sat hidden in plain geography, invisible from every angle below, accessible only to those who already knew it existed. Down in Drybone Ridge, a woman stood at a frosted window, palm flat against the glass, counting fence posts the way you count the things a dying man leaves behind. 14 hoofbeats on the frozen road. Not the horse she'd been dreading, something else entirely. May Callum had learned to read the sky before she learned to read words. Her father taught her both, in that order. Because Earl Callum was a practical man who understood that Colorado Territory in 1887 did not forgive people who could not predict what was coming. The sky told you about tomorrow. Words told you about everything else. Both were necessary. Neither was sufficient alone. She was standing at the kitchen window at 4 in the morning when the wind changed. Not the ordinary shift of mountain air moving between pressure systems. The kind that happened every night at elevation and meant nothing beyond the basic meteorology of high country winters. This was different. This came down from the northern peaks with a particular weight to it. The kind of cold that did not merely lower the temperature but altered the quality of the air itself, pressing against the cabin walls like something that had made up its mind. May pressed her palm flat against the glass, felt the cold move through it into her hand, held it there until her fingers went numb, and then stepped back and went to feed the stove, the pine she split 3 weeks ago, the last of it. She fed the fire with the careful economy of someone who had been managing a diminishing resource for long enough that the management had become instinct rather than calculation. 2 pieces now, 2 more in an hour. The stove door did not seal properly. It had not sealed properly since the second winter of her father's illness, when the cost of a replacement part had been weighed against the cost of medicine, and medicine had won, as it always did, as it always had to, as it would continue to do until the arithmetic finally stopped working in their favor entirely, which, according to Fletcher Moss's ledger, was going to be in 21 days. Earl Callum had filed on this land in 1864. 160 acres of Colorado Territory. Rocky and difficult in places, productive in others, the kind of land that rewarded the people willing to understand its specific character, rather than force it into a shape it didn't want to take. He had proved it up in 1869, built the cabin in 1871, built the barn in 1873, put in 14 fence posts along the road-facing boundary in 1876 when May was 7 years old. Working on a Saturday while she handed him tools and asked questions he answered fully, because he believed that a question deserved a complete answer, regardless of who was asking it. The consumption arrived in 1882 like a creditor who had been patient for a long time, and had finally decided to collect. The first loan against the land's value was $1,200, taken from First Territorial Bank in Glenwood Springs, against a note that Moss had written with the careful language of a man who understood that the people signing such documents were too desperate to read them closely. The second loan folded the interest from the first into a new principal and added enough to cover another year of medicine. The third did the same. By the fourth, the land itself was pledged at a valuation that bore little relationship to what Earl Callum had built on it, and every relationship to what the bank could recover at auction in a buyer's market, $28,400. May did not need to look at any document to produce that number. She had memorized it the same way she had memorized the crack in the ceiling above her bed, and the sound the wind made through the gap under the front door, and the exact number of steps between the kitchen and her father's room when she needed to move through the dark without waking her mother. These were the coordinates of her life. You committed them to memory because forgetting them cost you something you could not afford to pay. She poured the coffee when it was ready and stood at the window and watched the sky begin its slow gray transition from the blue-black of deep night to the particular washed-out silver of a Colorado winter morning. The barn, the fence posts, the road winding down from Drybone Ridge toward the valley, nothing on the road. Just cold and distance and the 14 fence posts her father had put in when his hands were still strong enough to drive stakes into frozen ground without stopping to rest. She did not hear her mother in the doorway until May Callum spoke. He was up twice in the night. May turned. Nora stood in her housecoat with her grey hair loose, her face carrying what it had carried for 5 years, which was not despair exactly, but the specific exhaustion of someone who had been managing hope in very small quantities for a very long time, and had become efficient at it out of necessity rather than choice. I heard. May poured a second cup, set it on the table. Fletcher Moss is coming today. Nora sat down, wrapped both hands around the cup. I know, he'll want an answer about the extension. There's no extension to give him an answer about. Nora's voice was even. She had arrived at the far side of denial some months ago and had set up residence in Plain Fact, which was a harder place to live but a more honest one. There's no collateral left, there's no guarantor, there's nothing. May sat across from her. They drank their coffee in the silence of two people who had already said everything useful that could be said about a situation and were now simply being present with each other inside it, which was its own kind of sustenance even when it changed nothing. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls and did not relent. Fletcher Moss arrived at 10 in the morning on a grey horse that moved with the comfortable certainty of an animal that had made this particular trip enough times to have stopped noticing it. He tied up at the fence post nearest the gate, which he did every time, which May had always noted as a specific kind of statement, using the evidence of a man's labor as your hitching post, while you came to take the rest of it. He knocked with the brisk efficiency of someone who did not expect to be kept waiting and had never been. May opened the door. Moss was 52, city-dressed in a coat unsuited to the mountain cold, carrying his leather satchel the way he always carried it, with the ease of something that had become an extension of his arm. He removed his hat, a performance of courtesy rather than the substance of it, Miss Callum. He stepped inside without being invited, which he had stopped waiting to be after the second visit. I trust your father is resting comfortably. He's resting. May stood in the center of the main room, not sitting. She had made that decision on his third visit, when she had understood that Moss always stood while they sat, and that this was not a coincidence. He opened the satchel, drew out the ledger with the practiced motion of someone who had done this in 100 homes and expected it to produce the same result in all of them. $28,412, May said, plus whatever this quarter's interest adds. 19 days remaining on the default notice. No refinancing option available without additional collateral or a guarantor, neither of which we have. Moss looked up from the ledger. A brief recalibration. He had prepared to deliver that information, and she had removed the need for him to deliver it, which disrupted the rhythm of a transaction he had performed often enough to find it comfortable. That is correct. He closed the ledger. Opened it again. A habit. The bank has been patient, Miss Callum. More patient than the terms strictly require. Is there anything on that page I haven't already read? A pause. The particular pause of someone deciding whether to be offended or to move on. Moss was a practical man. He moved on. If the family cannot meet the terms by the 19th, the bank will proceed with the foreclosure order. A sheriff's representative will assist with the removal of personal effects, and the property will be listed for public auction within 30 days. May looked at him. I understand, which was not the same as accepting, and she held the distinction between those two things as she walked him to the door, as she watched him untie his horse from her father's fence post, as she stood at the window and observed him ride back down the road toward the valley below. She held it the way you hold something that has value, precisely because it costs you something to keep. Understanding is not surrender. She had learned that early, in this house. From the man in the back room, she was still at the window, running through the arithmetic one final time, not because she expected the numbers to change, but because she needed to confirm for herself that she had not missed an angle, had not failed to calculate some possible approach that existed outside the range of what she had already tried, when the second horse appeared on the road. Not Moss's gray, something different. A mountain-bred animal, compact and deliberate, built for elevation rather than speed, moving with the careful intelligence of a creature that had spent years on difficult terrain and had developed opinions about the best way to navigate it. The rider was tall in the saddle, canvas coat, dark hat, sitting his horse with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned that unnecessary movement costs energy they might need later. May watched him turn onto the Callum Road. She did not move from the window until he had dismounted at the gate and checked the knot on his reins twice and run one hand along his horse's neck before turning toward the house. Small things. She collected them without deciding to, the way you collect evidence when you do not yet know what crime it belongs to. He knocked once. The knock of someone who expects to be heard, not of someone who expects to be welcomed. May opened the door, 30, maybe 31. Weather-worked face in the way of men who spent their time above 8,000 feet, where the sun and wind worked in partnership and neither negotiated. Eyes the color of winter sky before snow. Not gray exactly, more the shade between gray and something with more depth to it. Dark hair with the first silver at the temples. His hands, when she looked at them, were the hands of someone who worked with them regularly and had been doing so for years. Calloused at the palm and the inner fingers, but with a precision in their stillness that suggested the work was skilled rather than merely physical. He removed his hat, held it. Did not look away, Miss Callum. My name is Cole Danner. I have a proposition for you. May I come in? Not quite a question. Not quite a statement. Something that occupied the precise territory between the two. May held the door and looked at him for 3 full seconds, which was long enough to notice that he did not shift his weight, did not look away, did not perform any of the small social adjustments that people made when they were waiting on a threshold and feeling uncertain about what they'd find on the other side. He was not uncertain. She stepped back. He came in and removed his coat and did not sit when she gestured to the chair. Instead, he moved to the far wall, positioning himself where he could see the front door and the 2 windows at the same time. May noticed this and filed it in the same place she had filed the double-checked knot and the hand along the horse's neck. The accumulating record of a person she was still working out how to read. Nora appeared from the hallway. Her expression moved through wariness and landed on caution, which was where it usually landed when something unexpected arrived. Cole Danner did not spend time on pleasantries. He reached into his coat and produced a bank draft and set it on the table between them. $35,000. The number sat on the table. May did not reach for it. In exchange for marriage. His voice had the quality of someone who had prepared these words enough times to have removed all inflection from them, even. Certain. Not cold but not warm either. You would come with me, live at my home in the high country. The draft clears your debts and leaves your family with the remainder. Nora's breath made a sharp sound. Not a word. Something that had started as a word and been cut off before it arrived. May looked at the draft. Then at the man. Why what? Why do you need to purchase a wife? You appear capable. There are women who would marry you without a financial arrangement. Something moved across his face. Quick and gone. Not amusement exactly. The expression of a man who had expected a particular response and had been handed a different one and was recalibrating without revealing that he was doing it. I value honesty over romance, he said. A clear arrangement has no false expectations. That's a philosophy. It's not an answer, no. A pause. It isn't. Nora had come to stand at May's shoulder. The 3 of them held a silence with weight to it. The wind pressed against the cabin walls outside and found, as it always did, every gap it could. My wife died 4 years ago, Cole said. He said it the way people say things they have said before. Not with practiced smoothness, but with the specific flatness of repetition that has burned away the outward effect without touching what is underneath. I have been alone since then. I have reasons for approaching this the way I'm approaching it. I'm not prepared to explain all of them today. You'd like me to marry a stranger and relocate to an unspecified location based on a bank draft, and reasons you're not prepared to explain. Yes, May absorbed this. When did you arrive in Drybone Ridge? 3 weeks ago. She went very still. Not a physical stillness. She was already standing still. Something interior. The stillness of a person who has just received a piece of information that rearranges several other pieces. You have been in this settlement for 3 weeks, she said slowly. Yes, and in those 3 weeks you observed this family, our situation, our circumstances. Yes, without introducing yourself, without any indication of your presence. Cole held her gaze without flinching. Yes, Nora's hand found May's arm, steadying or cautioning. Probably both. May uncrossed her arms. She did not raise her voice because she had a policy about raised voices, and because this moment did not call for heat. It called for precision. You ran an experiment on a family without their knowledge or consent. You watched us in a difficult situation to assess whether we were useful to your purposes. And now you have appeared at our door with the offer as though the 3 weeks of observation were a courtesy rather than what they actually were, which was a decision about what information we deserved to have. Cole was quiet for a long moment. You're right. Say the rest of it. I made a decision about your information based on what I wanted to test rather than what you required to make a genuine choice. That was wrong. He did not look away and he did not soften it. I can't undo it. I can tell you it won't happen again. You can tell me that. Whether I believe it depends on what you do next. May sat down at the table across from the draft. She folded her hands. Tell me about your wife. The request landed on him the way unexpected things land on careful people. Not with visible impact, but with a slight shift in the quality of the stillness he inhabited. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might refuse. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat. Sarah Dana had been 26 years old when she died. She had been 22 when she married Cole. The same age May was now, sitting across from the same draft, being asked to make a version of the same decision. May absorbed all of this without comment. Sarah had come to the high country because Cole was there, and she loved him, and she believed in what he was trying to build. Cole's father ran Dana Timber at that time, an operation of significant size that his father managed with the single-minded focus of a man who understood output and margin and cared for nothing else in the running of a business. Equipment maintenance schedules were costs. Safety infrastructure was overhead. Both were managed downward whenever the quarter got tight. A cable failed on a Tuesday morning in November. Flagged for replacement 2 months prior. Not replaced because replacement came out of operating budget in a tight quarter. It did what neglected cables do under load on a steep grade. Sarah was standing where she had stood before, in a place that had been safe enough every other time, and on that particular Tuesday it was not. Cole's father died 8 months later of a heart that had been compromised for years, which the doctor described as the body's final accounting for a lifetime of doing everything at the hardest possible speed. Cole inherited the company at 27. He spent 2 years dismantling his father's operational practices and rebuilding them from the ground. New maintenance schedules, new safety protocols, new labor standards that cost more than his father's practices had cost and produced fewer short-term profits and 0 additional deaths. He described this, without self-congratulation, as context. As the difference between what the operation had been and what he had made it. May listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, "That's why you needed someone who understood hardship rather than someone who was impressed by what you have. Yes, and you believed observation over 3 weeks would tell you something that an honest conversation wouldn't." He was quiet. "Then, I was wrong about that too. I've understood it more clearly in the past 10 minutes than I did in the 3 weeks before them." May looked at the draft. 21 days, $28,000. Her father's breathing through the wall, the sound that had replaced silence in this house so gradually that she could no longer remember silence without it. She looked at Cole Dana. "I'll have an answer for you tomorrow evening, but I have conditions. If you agree to them now in writing, and if I agree tomorrow, then we proceed. If you don't agree, there's nothing further to discuss." She stood, went to the writing desk in the corner of the room, took paper and pen, wrote 5 items in her deliberate hand, the hand of someone who had learned to write with the understanding that words on paper were the only form of agreement that had legal standing when everything else failed. First, the bank draft delivered directly to First Territorial Bank and the debt cleared in full before May left Drybone Ridge, not after arrival, before departure. Second, unrestricted correspondence with her family. No review, no delay, no conditions on what she could write or receive. Third, private quarters. Her own space. Not contingent on any expectation beyond what was explicitly agreed to in this document. Fourth, if upon seeing the property she determined the arrangement was not tenable, she would be free to leave immediately and the debt clearance would remain in effect regardless. Fifth, the full names and roles of every person living or working at the property. She carried the paper to Cole and set it in front of him. He read it, all of it carefully, which she noted. The reading of a person taking the words seriously rather than scanning for the places they could be worked around. Then he picked up her pen from the table and signed at the bottom without changing a word. May took the paper back, looked at his signature. "There's a 6th condition." "It's not on the paper." Cole waited. "If you observe me again without my knowledge, For any reason, at any time, I will leave and I will not be found. She held his gaze. I need you to say that back to me. If I observe you without your knowledge again, for any reason, at any time, you will leave, and I won't find you. His voice was steady and without qualification. That is my commitment. May folded the paper, put it in her dress pocket. Be at the North Crossroads at dawn the morning after tomorrow, if the answer is yes. The bank receives confirmation of the draft's delivery by 8 in the morning before I go anywhere. Coldana stood, collected his hat and coat. At the door he stopped with his hand on the latch and said, without turning, "When you see where we're going, you'll be angry with me. I want you to know that in advance because when you feel it, I want you to remember I told you it was coming. The anger will be completely reasonable." Then the door opened and the cold came in briefly and he was gone and the room was quiet, except for the wind and May's father's breathing through the wall and the sound of $35,000 sitting on a table, waiting. The argument with Nora lasted until midnight. It went the way May had known it would go, which was that Nora raised every possible objection with the thoroughness of a woman who understood that raising objections was the only power available to her in a situation that had already moved beyond her control. May answered each one directly, not dismissively. Each concern was real and she treated it as real, but without allowing them to accumulate into an argument for paralysis, because paralysis was what they already had and she knew its weight. "You don't know who he is," Nora said, for the third time in a different configuration. "I know he signed the conditions without negotiating a single word. I know he told me about his wife when he didn't have to. I know he said the anger I'm going to feel when I see the place will be reasonable, which is not what a man with bad intentions says to the woman he's trying to deceive. Those are small things. Small things are the only evidence available before large things happen. People who wait for large evidence before making decisions always make them too late." Nora wrapped her hands around a cup of cold coffee and looked at the table. She was not done arguing. She was done with the arguments she had and was looking for new ones. May said, "Mama, tell me what you're actually afraid of." Nora looked up. Her eyes in the lamplight were the eyes of a woman who had spent 5 years being afraid of the specific and manageable and had arrived, through repetition, at a fear of the formless, of the next thing, of the shape of loss she hadn't yet learned to name. "I'm afraid you go somewhere I can't reach you." May reached across the table, took her mother's hands. "I'm going to write you every week without exception. And the first letter is going to tell you how to reach me." She held Nora's hands. "And you are going to be here when I write, which means the debt is cleared, which means Moss does not come back with a sheriff and a foreclosure order, which means you and Papa have time." Nora pressed her lips together. The expression of a woman doing what she had done for 5 years, which was converting fear into function because there was no alternative. "Your father needs to know," Nora said finally. "I'll tell him now." Earl Callum was awake. He had been awake, May suspected, since Moss had arrived that morning, tracking the shape of what was happening through the thin walls with the particular attention of a man who had been stripped of his ability to act and had developed his ability to listen in compensation. His eyes found her when she came through the door, clear still, bright with the specific quality that the illness had taken everything else and left. That May sat on the edge of his bed, told him plainly. A man named Cole Danner, a bank draft that covered the debt with $7,000 left over, marriage, high country. She would leave the day after tomorrow if she agreed, which she expected she would. Earl listened, breathed with the labor that had become the backdrop of everything in this room. Then he took her hand with a grip that was weaker than it had been and more determined than she expected. What kind of man signs a woman's conditions without changing them? A man who's been told no before and understands what it means. Earl almost smiled. Or a man who's smart enough to know which battles aren't worth winning. Both can be true, both usually are. He moved his thumb across her knuckles. "I didn't build those fence posts for you to spend your life mending them." His voice was the architectural whisper she had learned to hear as full speech. The voice of a man who used every word deliberately because he had a finite supply left. "I built them because something was worth protecting. If there's something worth going toward, maybe, you go. Don't stay for the fence." May held his hand. Did not say what she was thinking, which was that she did not know yet what she was going toward, only what she was going from, and that the difference between those two things was the entire question. She said, "I'll write to you, Earl. I know you will, and I'll tell you everything. I know that too." He closed his eyes. His chest rose and fell with the wet labor that had replaced easy breathing. "You always were the sharpest thing in any room. He doesn't know what he's agreed to yet." She sat with him until his breathing steadied into sleep. Then she went to the writing desk in her room and wrote him a letter she sealed and left on his bedside table. Not to be opened now, but for the later that she was not certain would include her presence. She wrote about the fence posts, what she understood about them now, what she intended to do with what he had built in her, the understanding of how to read a situation that he had given her by answering every question she'd ever asked with the complete truth. She did not sleep much. She was not afraid. Fear requires believing that the worst outcome is still preventable, and May had been living inside the worst outcome for long enough that the definition of worst had shifted. She was something else, alert, the feeling of someone at the edge of a decision that could not be unmade, preparing not by achieving certainty, but by making peace with the absence of it. Dawn came with cold, clear light and the wind still moving through the ridge pines with its low, persistent voice. Nora was already at the kitchen table when May came out. She had assembled a package without telling anyone she was going to. The sewing kit wrapped in cloth, the blue shawl she had made 3 winters ago, dried herbs from the kitchen garden, a small jar of preserved plums, because she knew her daughter, and she knew what her daughter would leave behind in the interest of traveling light. She pushed the package across the table without speaking. May sat down across from her, looked at what Nora had gathered. "Mama, don't." Nora's voice was steady in the way of something held deliberately in shape. "I want to give you more than this. I know I can't, so I'm giving you this." May picked up the blue shawl, held it. It was good wool, tightly woven, made in the months before Earl's illness had become consuming, from a pattern Nora had carried in her head from her own mother's house. She put it around her shoulders. It was warm immediately, with the specific warmth of things made by someone who was thinking about you while they worked. "Every week," May said. "Every week," Nora confirmed. They held each other for a long time, which was not their habit. They were not demonstrative women. It was not in the way they had been raised or the way the years had shaped them. But some moments require a different grammar, and this was one of them. May felt her mother's arms, the strength still in them despite everything, and pressed her face against her mother's shoulder the way she had when she was small, and the world had felt manageable, and the fence posts were still being built. Then she picked up her bag and walked out the front door into the thin winter light. The north crossroads were exactly 1 mile from the Callum property. May had walked that distance in both directions more times than she could count, for various reasons over various years. And she knew every section of the road, every place where the grade steepened, every stone that caught at the toe of a boot, every point where you could look back and still see the cabin roof, and every point where you could not. Coldana was already at the crossroads when she rounded the last bend, 2 horses. His own mountain gelding, dark and solid, and beside it a smaller mare with a coat the color of ash. The mare was watching May approach with the alert, considered expression of an animal that formed assessments and trusted them. Cole was checking the cinch on the mare's saddle when he heard May's footsteps and looked up without startlement, which confirmed that he had heard her coming before he saw her. "Her name is Cinder," Cole said. He turned back to finish the cinch. "Sure-footed and even-tempered. She'll take care of you in the high country." May approached Cinder slowly, let the mare catch her scent, running a slow breath across May's offered palm with the warmth that was startling against the cold air. May stroked the soft place between her nostrils. Cinder lowered her head slightly, acceptance rather than indifference, which was the better of the 2 available options. Cole produced a small document from his coat. "The bank received the draft this morning at 7:40. Confirmation here." He held it out. May read it. The amount, the date, the bank's official notation of receipt, and the debt account it had been applied to. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket alongside the signed condition list. "And the preacher, 1/4 mile up the trail. If you're still willing." She looked at him. The cold morning light on a face she was still mapping, still accumulating evidence about. "Where did you stay?" "While you were in Drybone Ridge." Cole held her gaze. He had committed to answering direct questions directly, and this was a direct question. There's a logging camp 3 miles east of the settlement road. Seasonal operation, empty in winter. I used one of the crew shelters. A pause. I came into the settlement only for supplies. 4 times in 3 weeks. I did not seek out conversation. May thought about this. 4 visits to a general store and post station in 3 weeks was unremarkable. Traveling men passed through regularly, bought supplies, moved on. A man who did not seek conversation would not be remembered with any specificity. And you watched from the camp, from the ridge above it mostly. With a glass, he said it without flinching from what it was. I know what it looks like. You told me what it was. She folded the bank confirmation a second time, a precise crease. I'm asking the details because I need to understand the scope of what I was not told. That's different from relitigating the argument, I understand. She put the confirmation in her pocket. Let's go find the preacher. The preacher was elderly, kind-eyed, arthritic in his writing hand, asking nothing beyond what the law required. The ceremony was shorter than any conversation May had ever had about it. She repeated words that arrived at a slight remove. The way things you have decided in advance tend to arrive in the moment of their execution. Not surprising, not unwelcome, simply the formalization of something already true. She signed the certificate with her old name for the last time. May Callum. In the handwriting she had learned at her father's kitchen table with a pencil stub and paper from the discarded pages of an account book. Then she was May Dana. A wife, a stranger in a new version of her own life, standing at a crossroads on a cold December morning, with the mountains above her and the settlement below, and everything she had been in one direction, and everything she did not yet know in the other. Cole paid the preacher, folded the certificate into his coat, turned north. They rode. The trail climbed immediately, the maintained road below Drybone Ridge giving way within the first mile to something narrower and more deliberate, pressing itself against the hillside as the elevation rose. The timber on both sides thickened and darkened. The air changed with each 100 feet of gain, growing colder and clearer in a way that required the lungs to adjust and produced, once they had, a kind of heightened attention that May recognized as what it felt like to breathe air that had not been breathed before. Cinder moved beneath her with the assured competence of an animal on familiar ground. May sat the mare and watched the trail, and watched Cole ahead of her, and thought about small things as evidence, and what the accumulated small things had told her, and whether she had read them correctly, which was a question she could not yet answer, and would not be able to answer for some time. They camped on the first night in a clearing beside a creek. Cole built a fire from materials he collected without searching, which meant he knew where they were, relative to what the terrain had to offer. May tended both horses with the brush from Cinder's saddlebag, working through the muscles of each animal's back and checking every hoof by feel in the firelight, the way Earl had taught her before the breeding stock was gone. She found nothing that didn't belong. The horses were well kept, which told her something about the man who kept them. Over dried beef and hardtack, May asked, "How many people work the property you're taking me to?" "Year-round, about 20. More in the working season, and the work is timber, yes." "How large an operation?" He looked at her across the fire, deciding something. "You'll see tomorrow." May ate her hardtack and said nothing further on the subject, which was not the same as accepting the non-answer. She was simply choosing the moment. She slept in pieces, waking once to find Cole adding wood to the fire, his back to her, moving with the quiet economy of someone who had done this in enough camp situations that the actions had become reflexive rather than considered. She watched the ceiling of the lean-to for a while, and thought about her father's voice saying, "Don't stay for the fence," and then stopped thinking about it, because she had a practice of stopping thoughts that were not actionable, and this one was not actionable, and the morning would require her. Morning came clear, which Cole had predicted the evening before by my reading something in the cloud texture and wind direction that May had not yet learned to read herself. They broke camp and rode. The second day's trail was harder than the first, narrower, technical in places where it ran along rock faces above drops that May measured by the sensation they produced rather than any attempt to gauge the actual distance. Cinder navigated these sections with a calm precision that May found instructive rather than merely reassuring. The horse had done this before and did not find it remarkable, which meant the trail had been traveled regularly enough to be known. At the worst of the exposed sections, Cole said, without looking back, Look at where you want to go, not at the drop. Your horse knows what she's doing. May looked at where she wanted to go. Cinder moved beneath her like a question being answered. And then the trail topped the final ridge and the plateau opened. The mountains arranged themselves on all sides with the patient scale of things that had been in exactly this position longer than any human frame of reference and intended to remain so. Below, through a gap in the timber at the plateau's far edge, a valley stretched, long and narrow and completely invisible from any direction May had ever approached these mountains, not hidden by design, hidden by the specific arrangement of ridges and elevation. That meant you could stand of every surrounding peak and see nothing but rock and pine, and have no idea that behind all of it, accessible only through the pass they had just navigated. Cole stopped his horse, said nothing. Let the view do what it did. May saw the buildings through the distant tree line. Not one building. An arrangement of structures, a barn and then another barn, a workshop with a chimney trailing smoke, a storehouse, and at the back of everything, on a low rise, a lodge, 2 stories, solid timber construction with the specific gravity of something built to last generations rather than seasons. Stone chimneys at both ends, a wraparound porch, windows that held the winter light. Cole said quietly, "Welcome to Dana Valley." May looked at the valley, at the buildings, at the lodge, at the smoke from the workshop chimney, at the size of the compound relative to what a man in a threadbare canvas coat managing a modest mountain operation would require. She turned and looked at Cole Dana. He met her eyes without looking away. He had known, she understood now, exactly what this moment would be. He had warned her it was coming, and he was here for it, present and not retreating, which was either courage or calculation, and she had not yet determined which. May said nothing. She turned her horse back toward the descent, and rode down into the valley to find out who she had married. The descent into the valley took 40 minutes on a road that should not have existed. That was the first thing May registered with any precision. Because imprecision was a luxury she did not allow herself, and the road demanded precision. It was too well engineered to be accidental, graded at consistent intervals, drained at the curves with channels cut into the uphill side, so runoff moved away from the surface rather than across it. Someone had thought about water. Someone had thought about load-bearing capacity. The stones along the steeper sections were placed rather than natural, fitted together with the specific care of people who understood that a road's value was proportional to its reliability in the worst conditions rather than the best. May rode down it and said nothing and thought about everything. The compound expanded as they descended. What had appeared from the plateau as a cluster of structures revealed itself as a functioning operation of significant scale. The nearer barn was large enough to stable 20 horses with room for equipment storage. The second barn had a loading dock along its eastern face, a dock designed for wagons of a specific size, which meant there was enough regular outbound freight to justify building the infrastructure for it rather than improvising each time. The workshop had 2 chimneys, not one, both active, suggesting multiple simultaneous processes that generated enough heat to require separate ventilation. The storehouse was padlocked with a lock May could identify as commercial grade from 20 yards. None of this was the property of a man who lived alone in the high country and came down twice a year for supplies. Workers noticed their approach before they reached the compound gate. A man emerged from the workshop doorway, wiping his hands on a cloth, watching 2 women crossed between the storehouse and the main lodge with loaded baskets, stopped mid-crossing, looked. A boy of perhaps 15, leading a team of draft horses toward the nearer barn, paused and let the horses stop and stood watching with the specific alert stillness of someone who understood that arrivals at this compound were significant events. They all looked at Cole first, then at May, and their expressions, each of them, moved through surprise and uncertainty, and arrived at something that was warmer than professional courtesy, but more restrained than celebration. The expression of people who had been waiting for something and were not yet certain whether what had arrived was the thing they had been waiting for. A woman came off the lodge porch with the authority of someone who owned the space she moved through and did not require anyone's permission to occupy it. Late 50s, gray hair cut short and practical. A face that had spent decades in high-altitude light, which had done to it what that light does. Clarified the lines, deepened the color, removed any quality that was not structural. She walked toward them without hurrying and without hesitation. Cole dismounted. "Vera, this is May Danner. She'll be living here. I expect everyone to treat her accordingly." Vera Tusk looked at May with the complete appraisal of someone who did not believe in partial assessments. It was not unkind, it was thorough. Then she extended her hand and said, "Welcome, Mrs. Danner. I'm Vera. I run the house and whatever else needs running when Mr. Danner is occupied with the timber side, which is most of the time." A brief look at Cole that contained equal parts reproach and something warmer. "I see he's been his usual thorough self in preparing you for what you'd find here." May shook her hand. Vera's grip was the grip of someone who had carried things her whole life and intended to keep doing so. "He warned me I'd be angry, and are you? Ask me in an hour." Vera's expression shifted. The appraisal completed itself and arrived at a conclusion she seemed to find acceptable. She took May's arm with the proprietary confidence of someone who had decided that action was required and had no intention of waiting for authorization. "Come inside. The men can manage the horses?" The inside of the lodge stopped May, 3 steps past the threshold. Not with the impact of luxury. There was no performance of wealth in the space, no assertion of status through ornament. What stopped her was intention. Every element of the main room had been chosen and arranged by someone who was thinking about how the room would actually be used by people who lived and worked in it. The stone fireplace built deep and wide for serious heat production. The furniture solid and worn in the specific way of things that had been used hard and maintained well. Bookshelves filling 2 complete walls, the volumes in them showing the varied wear of things read by different people at different times for different purposes. Vera led her upstairs. The bedroom was large. Writing desk at the window. 4-poster bed with a quilt that had been made by someone who knew what they were doing with a needle. A door at the far end of the room, that connects to Mr. Danner's suite. Vera opened the top drawer of the dresser and produced a key, set it on the dresser top. "The lock is new. I had it installed 3 days ago when he sent word ahead." She did not elaborate on this. She did not need to. "Your privacy is your own here, Mrs. Danner. That's not a courtesy. It's a condition of this household as I run it." May picked up the key, turned it in her hand, small brass, new enough that it had not yet acquired the patina of use. 3 days ago, Cole had sent word that he was bringing a wife. He had sent that word before he rode into Drybone Ridge, before he knocked on the Callum door, before he placed the draft on the table. He had been certain enough of the outcome, or committed enough to it regardless of the outcome, to prepare the room before the answer existed. She set the key back on the dresser and went to the window. The compound below was resuming its interrupted work. Silas Monk, the foreman, she would learn his name within the hour, had redirected the crew back to their tasks with the economical gestures of someone accustomed to managing disruptions. The boy with the draft horses had gotten them moving again. The 2 women with the baskets had resumed their crossing. The man from the workshop had gone back inside. This was a working operation, not an estate, not a monument to someone's wealth. A place that had been built to produce something and was doing so. Cole knocked on the open door. He had changed his shirt and washed his face, and stood in the doorway with the formality of someone who understood that a threshold, at this particular moment, meant something. May did not turn from the window. "How much?" He knew what she was asking. In total assessed value, somewhere above $3 million. Annual operating income, $85,000 in a good year. Less in a hard one, $3 million. She let the number exist in the room without reacting to it, which required more discipline than anything she had done since signing the certificate that morning. "You allowed me to believe you were a man of limited means," she said, still facing the window. "You presented yourself in clothing that communicated poverty. You rode a horse that communicated working class. You approached my family with an offer sized to suggest sacrifice on your part, and none of that was true. None of what I said was false. That is a distinction that requires a very generous interpretation of honesty. Yes, no qualification, no softening. It does." May turned from the window, looked at him directly. "What did 3 weeks of observation tell you that one honest conversation would not have?" Cole held her gaze. "Nothing. You're right. I would have learned the same things, probably more, because you ask better questions than I anticipated." He paused. "I made the decision based on fear, not strategy. I was afraid that if you knew the full scope of what you were being offered, you would not be able to make a decision I could trust. I wanted to know whether you would marry a man, not a situation, and so you manufactured a situation in which I did not have the information I needed to make a genuine choice. You called it a test. I call it a decision made on my behalf about what I deserve to know. She kept her voice at the same register it had been at since she entered this room. Even, exact. I am not angry about being here. I am angry about the method. Those are different things, I know. Do you understand why they're different? Because a choice made without full information is not truly a choice. You can sign every document available and the signature still doesn't represent genuine consent if the context was manufactured. Yes, May looked at him. So, new terms. Not replacing the ones you signed. Those stand. Additional terms. From this point forward, you do not make decisions about my information. Any information that affects my life here, my role here, my safety here. I receive it directly and immediately. Not when you've decided I'm ready for it. When it exists, agreed. In writing, he crossed to the writing desk. She watched him write the commitment himself in his own hand, without prompting, and sign it. He set the pen down and slid the paper toward her. She read it, added one line at the bottom in her own hand. He read her addition, signed again. The line read, "This includes all material risks, complications, and disputes affecting the operation, to be shared within 48 hours of their becoming known to Cole Danner." She folded the paper, put it in her pocket with the first signed document, the condition list, and the bank confirmation. 3 pieces of paper that represented the legal and moral architecture of a situation she was still mapping. The anger was real, and she had expressed it, and it had been received without deflection. That was not resolution. But it was a foundation different from nothing, Cole said. "There's something else you need to know. I was going to tell you after you'd settled. But the new terms mean I tell you now." May sat at the writing desk. "Go ahead." Boyd Danner was 54 years old and had the quality of intelligence that becomes dangerous when it is not matched by discipline or scruple. Sharp enough to see opportunity clearly, careless enough to pursue it through whatever means were available. He was Cole's father's younger brother, the second son in a family that had organized its resources around the first, and he had spent 50 years experiencing this arrangement as an injustice rather than a circumstance. Cole's father had bailed Boyd out twice. The first time, Boyd was 32 and had lost a significant sum in a mining venture that had been more speculation than investment, which even Boyd had understood at the time, though he had asked for the bailout on the grounds that he had not understood. The second time, Boyd was 45 and had lost considerably more through a combination of gambling debts and a business arrangement that turned out to be neither legitimate nor retrievable. Cole's father had paid both debts with the specific weariness of a man who had known the second request was coming before the first one was resolved. When the will was read, Boyd received nothing. The operation, the land, all of it went to Cole. Boyd had contested the will on grounds of testamentary incapacity, a claim that the legal proceeding found insufficient and dismissed. He had not accepted the dismissal. He had redirected. "For the past 3 years he's been working the edges," Cole said. "Approaching investors with concerns about my management practices. Talking to contractors about payment delays that didn't happen the way he described them. Suggesting to partners that my changes to the operations practices were the decisions of an idealist rather than a businessman." May had been listening with the specific attention of someone building a structural model of a problem. "Has he made any formal moves?" "Until last week, no. Informal pressure only." Cole set a letter on the desk between them. The letterhead was from a Denver firm. "This arrived 4 days ago. Boyd has filed a supplementary petition with the territorial court requesting a formal review of the estate proceedings." May read the letter. Read it again, looked at the signature, the firm name, the specific language of the petition's stated grounds. He hired Marsh and Calloway. She set the letter down. "That firm specializes in estate disputes and property recovery litigation, not general business concerns. Moss, the bank representative who manages our debt, uses them when the bank needs to move on a contested foreclosure." She looked at Cole. "Boyd didn't file this because he's concerned about management practices. He filed it because he has a legal strategy and he needed this petition as a document of record for the next step in that strategy." Cole was watching her. "Go on. The petition establishes documented family concern about your management. He'll use that document in front of your investors at the meeting he's called. He's building a pattern. Not a single complaint, but a series of independently filed, independently witnessed expressions of concern. Courts respond to patterns. Investors respond to patterns. She looked at the letter again. When is the meeting? 10 days from today. Denver, which means we leave in 5. May set the letter on the desk with a precise alignment that had nothing to do with neatness, and everything to do with needing something to be orderly while she arranged the rest of it in her mind. You've been responding to Boyd's moves individually, defending each one as it arrives. That's the wrong approach, because defending validates the attack as worth defending against. Because defending puts you in Boyd's frame. He sets the question, you answer it, the investors watch you answer it, and the act of answering is itself the evidence he wants. A man on trial in front of his own stakeholders. She stood, moved to the window, the compound below working in the late afternoon light. Who are the investors attending the meeting? Cole listed them. Edmund Carroll, who held contracts for railroad supply and valued above all else the consistency of an operation that never caused him a problem. James Whitfield, representing Eastern Capital looking for Western resource investments, interested in growth trajectories and return potential. Judith Pratt, who had built Pratt Mining from a single Nevada silver claim into an operation that covered 3 territories, and who made every decision herself and was answered to by no one. Carroll needs stability, May said. Boyd will argue instability, any delivery variation, any management change he can frame as unpredictability. Whitfield needs growth potential. Boyd will argue that your sustainable practices cap the operation's ceiling, that a more aggressive extraction model would produce better returns. Pratt, she stopped. Pratt will form her own judgment regardless of what anyone argues, Cole said. Yes, which means she's the one who matters most. Carroll and Whitfield can be influenced by evidence. Pratt will decide based on what she observes. May turned from the window. What does she observe when she looks at a timber operation run by a 31-year-old bachelor who lives alone in a hidden valley and has restructured his father's practices in ways that reduced short-term profit? Cole was quiet for a moment. A man making principled decisions without accountability to anyone who would push back. A man who has not demonstrated that he can form genuine partnerships. That's different from having investors. Investors are a financial relationship. A partnership requires the kind of collaboration that changes how you make decisions, not just who receives the proceeds. May looked at him directly. That's why you needed a wife for this meeting. Not for appearances. Because Pratt is going to assess whether you are the kind of person who builds something together or someone who builds alone and calls it leadership. Cole met her eyes steadily. Yes. Then we don't perform a partnership for her benefit. We show up as one, which means for the next 5 days I need to understand this operation well enough to speak about it as someone who actually runs it. Not someone who was briefed on the way to Denver. She pulled a chair to the desk. Start with the contracts, all of them, and start with the ones that are problems, not the ones that work. Cole sat across from her and began. 5 days at the main table in Cole's office, which became as much May's as his, by the end of the second morning, without either of them formally deciding that the first morning May asked 41 questions. She counted, not because the number mattered, but because she had a habit of counting things that she could count in situations where larger quantities were not countable. And 41 questions felt like the right density of ignorance to be honest about. Some of the questions were basic. She did not pretend they weren't. What is a board foot? How does the contract pricing relate to seasonal demand variation? Why does the March delivery schedule differ from the September one when the contracted volume is the same? Silas Monk, who had been brought in on the second morning to explain the operational side of things May couldn't find in the ledgers, answered the basic questions without condescension, which she noted. He was a man who had spent 30 years developing expertise and had enough of it to be generous with it. The mark of someone secure in what he knew rather than dependent on others' ignorance for his status. On the afternoon of the second day, working through a stack of hauling contracts while Cole was out with Silas, reviewing a repair to the upper trail, May read Clause 14, Section B of the Morrison hauling agreement for the third time and stopped. She read it a fourth time to confirm she had understood it correctly. The clause allowed the hauler to adjust delivery schedules unilaterally with 10 days' notice and without financial penalty. On its own, a risk management provision that benefited the hauler, common enough in such agreements. But May had spent the morning reading the supply contracts with Carroll's railroad company, which carried a 2% per week penalty for delivery delays, regardless of cause. Which meant that whenever Morrison exercised Clause 14B and pushed a delivery back, Dana Timber absorbed the downstream penalty from Carroll, while Morrison faced no consequence whatsoever for triggering it. She carried the contracts to the workshop where Silas was applying the day's remaining light to a piece of equipment adjustment. She set both documents on his workbench, pointed to the relevant clauses, said nothing. Silas read them, looked at her. Read them again. 7 years, he said. That contract has been in place for 7 years. Has Morrison exercised the delay provision? 3 times that I know of. Maybe more before my tenure. And Dana Timber absorbed the Carroll penalties each time. Silas put down the tool he was holding. His face was doing something that had not previously been available in May's observation of it. The expression of someone confronting evidence that a problem they had been working around without naming had just been named. Yes, each time. Has anyone connected these 2 clauses before? No, a pause. I looked at that Morrison contract when I took the foreman position. I saw the delay provision. I thought it was standard hauler language. It's standard in isolation. It's not standard when the downstream contracts carry uncapped delay penalties. May picked up both documents. Can Morrison be renegotiated? He'll push back. He has a comfortable arrangement. What are the alternatives? Silas thought about it. 2 other haulers in the territory with the capacity to take our volume. Neither currently at our scale, but both could get there with a guaranteed contract. So we have leverage. Silas looked at her with the expression of someone re-examining an assumption they had not previously identified as an assumption. Yes, he said slowly. We do. She brought both contracts to Cole that evening. Set them on the table. Let him read without prompting. He was quiet for longer than she expected. Then, my father negotiated the Morrison contract. I reviewed it during the estate transition and missed this. You were reading individual contracts for what they said. The problem lives in the relationship between 2 contracts. It's not visible until you're reading them as a system. How did you see it? Because I read the Carroll contract first and the Morrison contract second, and I was looking for how the pieces connected rather than whether each piece made sense on its own. She sat across from him. I spent 5 years reading documents that were designed to look reasonable in isolation and extract value through their interaction with other documents. Moss's bank agreements worked the same way. The individual terms were defensible. The combination was a trap. Cole looked at the contracts, then at her. We need to initiate the Morrison renegotiation before the Denver meeting, before we leave, which is in 3 days, which means tomorrow. She pulled a piece of paper toward her. And we need a plan for the meeting that doesn't involve defending anything Boyd has raised. Every defense is a concession that the attack had merit. Then what do? We go to Denver to announce something, not to answer something. Boyd has called a meeting about the past. We arrive with the future. She looked at him. Is there anything you've been planning to do with this operation that you haven't yet moved on, because the timing wasn't right or the resources weren't aligned? Cole was quiet for a moment. A partnership with Pratt Mining. 30-year supply agreement for structural timber for her mining infrastructure. I've been in correspondence with her representatives for 4 months. The terms are mostly agreed. I've been waiting to formalize it until the operating season results were compiled. May looked at him. That's what we take to Denver. The partnership isn't finalized. Then we approach Pratt directly before the meeting and get her preliminary commitment in writing. She picked up the pen. Write me everything you know about Judith Pratt. What she values, what she's built, what she's protecting. What she would find compelling about a 30-year supply relationship with an operation that practices sustainable extraction. Cole began to talk. May began to write. Outside the valley settled into night with the efficiency of a place that did not waste time on transitions. On the 4th day of preparation, Boyd's strategy revealed a new dimension. Silas came to the office at mid-morning with the specific gravity of someone carrying information they would have preferred not to be carrying. He set a letter on the table between Cole and May. It had been addressed to Cole but opened, which he explained. It had arrived at the lower trailhead station and been brought up by one of the supply riders who had noted the return address, a Denver hotel, and understood it might be urgent. The letter was from one of Boyd's legal representatives. It was a deposition notice for a foreman at Dana Timber's secondary operation in the Eastern Valley. A man named Grayson, 15-year veteran of the operation, trusted with significant independent authority at the secondary site. The Eastern operation ran 11 men and covered 42 acres of second-growth timber, the harvest from which comprised roughly 30% of Dana Timber's annual contracted volume. Attached to the deposition notice was a summary of Grayson's preliminary testimony, operational information, specific contract details, cost structures, maintenance schedules, the names and compensation of senior crew. Information that Grayson had no reason to share with Boyd's attorneys unless he had been providing it to Boyd directly. May read the deposition summary, then the preliminary testimony, then the deposition notice header, which listed the date of Grayson's first contact with Boyd's legal team. She looked at Silas, 14 months ago. His first contact with Boyd's team was 14 months ago, 2 months after he transferred to the Eastern operation. Silas's jaw tightened. 2 months after he asked to transfer, he requested the transfer, said he wanted more independent responsibility. The Eastern site was the right fit for his experience level. Silas set down the papers. I approved it. I recommended it to Cole. Boyd approached him, or he approached Boyd. May looked at the dates again. The transfer request and the first contact with Boyd's team are 2 months apart. That's not enough time for Boyd to have identified Grayson, recruited him, and arranged the transfer. Grayson went to Boyd. Cole had been reading over May's shoulder. Why, Silas was quiet for a moment, the quiet of a man doing an uncomfortable calculation. There was a disagreement, before the transfer. About wages, he set down his coffee cup with care. Grayson thought he deserved foreman pay at the Valley operation. My position was that his tenure was long, but his supervisory experience was limited and the Valley foreman role required both. A pause. I told him that clearly. He accepted it. I believed he had accepted it. He accepted the decision and looked for another way to address the grievance, May said. Not as a judgment, as the completion of a sequence. Boyd offered him something. Money, a promised role in the operation if the estate challenge succeeded, something concrete. And Grayson calculated that the risk of providing information was lower than the cost of staying where he was. If Boyd had won the challenge, Cole said slowly, he would have needed experienced people who knew the operation. Grayson would have been valuable to him, and Boyd would have known that when he made the offer, May folded the deposition notice, which means Grayson wasn't corrupted by ideology or loyalty. He made a transaction, which means he can make a different transaction. Silas, you want to approach him? Not yet. Not before the Denver meeting. If we confront him now, Boyd knows we have the deposition notice and adjusts his strategy. We lose the advantage of him not knowing what we know. She set the folded notice on the desk. But after Denver, when Boyd's challenge has failed publicly, Grayson's calculation changes entirely. The thing he was promised, a role in a reorganized operation under Boyd's control, no longer exists. What he has instead is a documented record of providing confidential information to an unsuccessful estate challenger. That's exposure he didn't expect to be carrying. Cole, he'll be afraid of termination, or legal action, which gives us the terms of a different offer. His full account of what he provided to Boyd and when, documented and notarized, in exchange for continued employment in a reassigned role with less access to contract and financial information. May looked at Cole steadily. If he cooperates, we have direct evidence of Boyd's solicitation strategy for any future proceedings. If he refuses, we proceed with the role change regardless. Either way, the information leak stops. Silas. And if he goes back to Boyd and tells him we approached, then Boyd knows his inside source has been identified and burned. Which ends that particular avenue regardless. May picked up the documents and aligned them into a clean stack. But Grayson won't go to Boyd. By then, Boyd will have failed publicly in Denver. There will be nothing Boyd can offer him and nothing Grayson gains from a further association. If Cole looked at the stack of documents, at May, at Silas, after Denver, he said. After Denver, May confirmed. Right now we need to finish the Pratt proposal. They worked until the lamp burned low. Outside the valley was dark and cold and entirely itself, which was a place that produced problems and also, May was beginning to understand, produced the specific quality of thinking required to solve them. They left for Denver on the 5th morning before the light was full. The ride down from the valley and the coach journey covered 4 days. May used the time in the coach to review everything she had committed to memory over the previous week. Not reviewing for completeness, but examining for angles, turning each piece of information and looking at it from directions she had not yet used. What would Boyd's attorney emphasize first? What would Carol be most susceptible to? What would Pratt be watching for that had nothing to do with the formal arguments? On the second night in a way station inn outside of Pueblo, Cole came downstairs to find May already at the common room table, with the Morrison contract draft spread before her, a single lamp, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. "You should sleep," he said. "I will." She did not look up. "Sit down. I want to go over the Pratt approach again." He sat. They worked until midnight. When she finally set the papers aside and looked up, the lamp had burned low and the inn was completely quiet. Cole said, "Can I ask you something that isn't about the meeting?" She waited. "Do you regret coming?" May considered the question the way she considered everything, directly and without the cushioning of sentiment. "No." She picked up the cold coffee and set it back down. "I came to save my family from a situation that was going to end badly regardless of what I did. That part worked. The rest," she paused. "The rest is more than I expected. In several directions." "What directions?" "The work. I didn't expect to find work worth doing here. I expected to find a household to manage and a role to fill." She looked at him across the table. "And I didn't expect." She stopped again. Cole waited without filling the pause, which she had come to understand was one of his more significant qualities. "I didn't expect to find the work clarifying," she said finally. "Not just interesting. Clarifying. Like a problem that shows you something about yourself in the solving of it." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father built that operation to produce wealth. I've been trying to build it to produce something more durable than wealth. But I've been doing it alone, which means every decision I've questioned without anyone who would push back." He looked at his hands on the table. "I hired Silas because he's competent. I respect his operational judgment. But he won't tell me I'm wrong about something he's not paid to have an opinion on." A pause. "You have no such limitation?" "No." May almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it occupied the same territory. "I don't." They reached Denver on the fourth day. The Windsor Hotel received Cole with the ease of a place that recognized a returning guest who did not require spectacle and would not be given it regardless. Their suite occupied a corner of the third floor with windows on two sides and the specific quiet that buildings achieve only at height, above the city's working noise. Cole had written ahead to Judith Pratt's office from a way station 3 days earlier, requesting a meeting before the formal gathering. May had drafted the letter. Not the business language, Cole had handled that, but the framing of the request, which was not a request for a courtesy meeting, but an offer of specific information Pratt would find useful, structured in a way that made refusing the meeting more costly than attending it. Pratt's reply was waiting at the hotel desk. She would meet them at 7 in the morning on the day of the formal gathering. May read the reply twice. Then she said, "She's coming because of what I wrote about the 30-year supply framework. Not the courtesy of the invitation. The specific yield projection language in the second paragraph. That's what got her to the table." "Cole, how do you know?" "Because she's a person who acts on specific information rather than general relationship. I wrote the letter in her language, not the language of the operation we're offering, but the language of the problem she has, which is infrastructure supply certainty for the next 3 decades of mining expansion." The letter told her we had read her problem correctly. That's what she responded to. Cole looked at her. "Vera told me something before we left. She said she'd been watching you." "I know. I don't mind being watched when the watching is honest. She said you were the first person to arrive at this compound who didn't spend the first day trying to figure out how to belong here." He held her gaze. "She said you spent the first day trying to figure out how it worked." May set down the reply. "Those are 2 different orientations toward a new situation?" "Yes." He paused. "Vera's been managing that compound for 11 years. She's seen a lot of new situations arrive." He stopped, considered his words. "She thinks you were the right one." May looked at him steadily. "Do you?" Cole said. "Yes. Though I understand I haven't yet done enough to deserve that being believed. You've done enough for it to be considered." She picked up the letter. "Get some sleep. The meeting is at 2 tomorrow, and we need to be at Pratt's office at 7, which means I need an hour with the yield projections before we go. When will you sleep?" "After the meeting." She looked up. I always sleep after. Judith Pratt's office was on the third floor of a building on Blake Street that announced nothing about itself from the outside. Inside, working maps on one wall, filing systems labeled in Pratt's own hand, a desk covered in active documents with the specific disorder of serious work in progress rather than stage competence. Pratt was already there, already working. She looked up when they came in, assessed both of them in the time it takes to draw a breath, and said, "Sit." They sat. "I've read your correspondence," Pratt said, addressing Cole. Then she looked at May, "And I've made some inquiries about the Morrison contract dispute that your letter mentioned. The renegotiation was initiated this week. Preliminary terms agreed," May said. "Morrison's signature pending legal review." Pratt looked at her for a moment. "Who identified the Clause 14B problem?" "I did." "How long had it been in the contract?" 7 years. "And no one in the operation saw it?" "Everyone in the operation was reading contracts individually. The problem only becomes visible when you read them as a system." Pratt set down the document she had been holding. "How long have you been with Dana Timber?" 8 days. The room was quiet for 3 seconds. Then Pratt looked at Cole. "Where did you find her?" "Drybone Ridge. Mountain settlement, Colorado Territory, family background," May answered for herself. "My father was a rancher, 160 acres filed in 1864. We lost most of it to medical debt over 5 years of his illness." She did not soften this or frame it differently. "I spent 5 reading the documents associated with that loss and the legal structures that produced it. That's my background." Pratt looked at May for a long moment, the look of a person in the specific act of recognition, not of an individual but of a type she had been looking for. "I built my first claim on land everyone in the territory said was played out. It was not played out. It was deep." She pulled a document from the desk, set it between them. "The 30-year supply framework your letter described. Walk me through the yield projection methodology." May walked her through it. All of it. "Not as a presentation," Pratt interrupted frequently with specific technical challenges, which May answered directly and without defensiveness, and twice said she did not know and would find out, which Pratt received with a slight nod of someone who values accuracy over performance. By the end of 40 minutes, Pratt had made notes on the framework's margins in her own hand and asked for a pen to sign the preliminary agreement. She signed, pushed it toward Cole. He signed. Pratt looked at May. "I want to speak with you after the formal meeting." "Alone." She said it the way she said everything, as information rather than invitation, a fact about what was going to happen. "I have something to propose that is separate from the supply framework." The territorial business office at 2 in the afternoon held 23 people, which May counted during the first 2 minutes while appearing to review the documents in her folio. Boyd Danner arrived with 3 supporters and his legal representative and occupied the far end of the room with the practiced confidence of someone who had planned this meeting for months and believed the planning was complete. He looked at May with the specific assessment of someone encountering an element that was not in his original calculations and needing to determine quickly how much adjustment it required. May watched him decide that she was the easier target, the move of someone who looked at her and saw what he expected: youth, uncertain origin, absence of formal credentials, and filed her accordingly. He had looked at the same information as Fletcher Moss once had and arrived at the same wrong answer. The commissioner opened the meeting. Boyd presented his case. Testamentary incapacity, the medical records from Cole's father's final year showing decline, an expert witness prepared to testify about decision-making capacity, management deviation, the sustainable practices, the reduced short-term margins, the labor cost increases, all framed as decisions that degraded the asset's value. And then, turning to May with an expression calibrated to suggest reluctance, the marriage. Impulsive, unexplained. A person of no established background brought into a $3 million operation with no demonstrated capacity and no accountability. A man, Boyd said, whose personal judgment had become indistinguishable from his business judgment, and whose business judgment was evidenced by both. Cole started to stand. May's hand found his arm beneath the table, not grasping, the specific pressure of a single message. Not yet. He stayed. May stood, the room recalibrated. Not dramatically. There was no gasp, no visible surprise. Just a quiet reorientation of a body of people who had been tracking one focal point and now had a different one. Boyd's expression moved through surprise and arrived at something that recognized it had misjudged the terrain. "Mr. Boyd Danner." Her voice was even and did not require the room to be quiet, but the room was quiet anyway. "You've described my presence here as evidence of poor judgment. I'd like to address that." She opened her folio, set documents on the table in sequence, 3 stacks, each directed to a different person. To Carol, the Morrison renegotiation summary, the 7-year cost analysis of the Clause 14B problem, and the projected savings over the next 5 years under the new terms. The operation has been absorbing downstream penalties from a hauling contract flaw for 7 years. That flaw was identified and corrected this week. Your delivery schedule reliability improves directly as a result. I have the preliminary signed terms here. Carol picked up the document, began reading to Whitfield, the comparative yield trajectory analysis, pulling data from 12 Colorado timber operations over 15 years, showing the production degradation curves of maximum extraction models versus sustainable harvest practices. Operations that used aggressive extraction at their peak are currently producing at 30 to 40% of that peak because the resource base was degraded faster than it regenerated. Danner Timber's current yield is 92% of its 5-year average and modeled to maintain that level for 40 years. The numbers support the methodology. Whitfield turned to the first chart. Kept reading to Pratt, a copy of the signed preliminary partnership framework, 30 years, infrastructure timber supply for Pratt mining operations across Nevada and Colorado. Signed that morning. This partnership has been in development for 4 months and was formalized this morning. It represents the kind of long-range thinking that defines how this operation approaches every decision. A pause. Including the decision about who to bring into it. Pratt looked at her copy. Set it down with the flat satisfaction of someone whose assessment had been confirmed rather than surprised. Boyd moved to redirect. These documents don't address the fundamental concern about. They address them precisely. May did not raise her voice. Did not need to. You've argued that the decisions made in running this operation reflect a pattern of poor judgment. In the past 8 days, a 7-year contract flaw was identified and corrected. A 30-year supply partnership was formalized, and a comprehensive yield analysis was completed that contextualizes every management decision you've characterized as deviation. She let that sit for 2 seconds. The pattern you've identified exists. It is a pattern of doing the work that needed doing. She turned to the commissioner. The information Boyd has presented today was, in significant part, sourced from inside the operation. We know this because we have the deposition notice and summary for a senior employee who has been providing operational data to Boyd's legal representatives for over a year. She set a copy of the deposition notice on the table. We are not raising this to impugn that employee's character. We are raising it to establish that Boyd has had access to every operational detail he could have wanted and has chosen to present those details in the specific framing that serves his petition. The room deserves to know the quality of the objectivity they're being asked to trust. Boyd's face had gone through several configurations in the past 4 minutes and had arrived at something that was not any of the things he had prepared to display. Carol set his documents down. The Morrison renegotiation. When does it finalize? Legal review is 30 days. Terms are agreed, and the Carol contract delivery penalties. These would have been absorbed by Danner Timber and not passed on to us. Correct. Your pricing was unaffected. The operational cost was internal. Carol nodded. The nod of a man who has reached a conclusion and is confirming it to himself. Whitfield looked up from the yield analysis. The 40-year projection. What's the model for reforestation rate? May answered. Specifically, he asked 2 follow-up questions. She answered both. He looked at Pratt. Pratt looked back at him with the expression of someone who had made a decision considerably earlier in the proceedings. The commissioner called for stakeholder statements. Carol expressed continued confidence in current management and noted that the Morrison renegotiation represented exactly the kind of operational oversight he expected from a well-run enterprise. Whitfield said he had arrived expecting to hear about problems and had instead received a business presentation that addressed concerns he had not previously known to articulate, which was a better outcome than he had anticipated. Pratt said she had signed a 30-year supply agreement that morning and that her signature was not a courtesy gesture. Boyd filed a formal objection. The commissioner received it and noted it and set it aside. Boyd left without speaking to Cole. His legal representative followed. 2 of his 3 supporters fell away from his orbit between the door of the business office and the street outside, their disengagement visible in the way of people who had backed a position that had just lost its ground and were recalculating the cost of continued association. The 3rd supporter stopped on his way out, introduced himself to May, expressed that he had found the yield analysis compelling, and asked whether the operational methodology document was available for distribution. May gave him a copy from the folio. Judith Pratt crossed the room when the formal proceedings had dissolved into conversation and document exchange. She did not look at Cole. She looked at May. "I said I wanted to speak with you alone." She glanced at Cole briefly. "That invitation still stands. Tomorrow morning, my office. 8 o'clock then to May directly. What I have to propose is not about the supply agreement, it's about you." Specifically, May held her gaze. "I'll be there." Pratt nodded, left. Cole appeared at May's shoulder. He had been behind her during the exchange with Pratt and had remained there, which she had been aware of without looking. He said, "Just about you specifically, before the meeting." When her office confirmed the 7 o'clock appointment, her assistant noted that Mrs. Danner's attendance was a condition of the meeting. May filed this in the same place she had filed the double-check knot, and the hand along the horse's neck and every other small piece of evidence she had been accumulating since a man appeared at her door in a canvas coat and placed $35,000 on a table. The collection had grown considerably since then. The picture it made was different from any picture she had expected when she walked out of the Callum cabin 10 days ago. She said, "What time is the Harriet Danner dinner?" Cole looked at her. 7 this evening. "You don't have to go." "Yes, I do." She closed the folio. "Boyd lost today. Harriet is going to try to recover what she can in a social setting where the rules are different and she's been playing the game longer than I've been alive." May straightened her jacket. "Which means I need to be there. And I need to not perform being comfortable. I need to actually be comfortable, which is different." Cole looked at her steadily. "Are you?" May considered this honestly. "With everything that matters," she said, "yes." The Harriet Danner dinner occupied a mansion on Capitol Hill that announced its owner's priorities in the same way that all such houses did, through scale rather than subtlety, through the accumulation of detail that required money to produce and staff to maintain and guests to witness. Gas lamps at the entrance, a circular drive, a butler who opened the door before Cole had finished climbing the step, which meant someone had been watching for their arrival. Harriet Danner was 51 and had spent those years developing the specific competency of a woman who understood that social architecture was a form of power and who had built hers with the same deliberate attention that Cole had applied to the Valley's road system. Everything in her house was placed. Everything served a purpose beyond its apparent purpose. The flowers on the entry table were not decorative. They established a register of expense that recalibrated every guest's sense of where they stood relative to the hostess. The seating arrangement at the dining table was not hospitality. It was strategy. May saw all of this within 4 minutes of entering the house and found it neither intimidating nor impressive. Familiar, rather. Fletcher Moss had operated the same way, using the performance of authority to do the work that actual authority required effort to establish. She had learned to read through performance to the mechanism underneath. Harriet came forward with the social warmth of someone who had perfected warmth as a technique. She embraced Cole with the brief efficiency of family obligation and turned to May with an expression that was calibrated to welcome and was actually inventory. "Mrs. Danner." A moment's pause that was not quite a pause. "How lovely you look so. Fresh. Mountain life must agree with you, fresh." The word chosen to suggest youth, and specifically the youth of someone who had not yet acquired what the speaker considered necessary refinement. May received it without reaction. The other guests, Patricia Vance and her husband, copper mining money from Leadville, solid and watchful. Judge Everett Hale and his wife Catherine, territorial judiciary, people who spent their professional lives distinguishing between what was said and what was meant. 2 other couples May filed by their associations, one connected to Boyd's legal firm, one to the railroad interests Carol represented, both here for reasons that had nothing to do with dinner. The table was set for 12 with the elaborateness of someone who understood that complexity could be weaponized, 7 pieces of silverware per setting, 4 glasses, a centerpiece that required 3 feet of clearance and blocked sightlines across the table in a way that was not accidental. May sat where she was placed and unfolded her napkin and looked at the silverware with the directness of someone taking inventory rather than the anxiety of someone uncertain how to proceed. She knew which fork to use for the first course because she had asked Vera 3 days before leaving the valley, specifically and practically, and Vera had told her, and she had committed it to memory along with everything else worth committing. Preparation was not performance. It was respect for the conditions she was entering. Harriet opened the table conversation from her end with the ease of someone who had been doing it for 30 years. Mrs. Danner, I imagine Denver feels quite different from what you're accustomed to. The pace here can be overwhelming for people from a breath that was not quite a pause, quieter environments. Patricia Vance, 2 seats to May's left, looked briefly at her wine glass. Different rather than overwhelming, May said. In Drybone Ridge, I knew the name and situation of every family within 10 miles. Here I've met people in 48 hours whose work is shaping how the entire territory develops. That's not overwhelming. It's clarifying. Harriet pivoted smoothly, of course, though the social aspects must require some adjustment. Denver has its own culture, shall we say. Its own expectations. Most places do. May looked at Harriet pleasantly. The expectations vary. The underlying structure tends to be the same. Who has resources, who needs something, who is building, and who is protecting what they've built. Once you identify those, the surface differences become navigable. Catherine Hale, the judge's wife, set down her fork. She had the expression of someone who had been recording a conversation in the margin of her attention and had just heard something worth underscoring. Harriet's expression made a small adjustment. She changed course. Your husband made some significant moves at the territorial meeting today, she said, her voice carrying the particular warmth of someone preparing to use warmth as a knife. The Pratt partnership, quite sudden. I imagine the preparation was extensive. The relationship with Mrs. Pratt has been developing for 4 months. The formal framework was the natural conclusion of conversations already in progress. And you were involved in those conversations. I'm involved in the operations of Danner Timber. That includes its relationships. From the very beginning of your marriage, a pause selected for its effect. That's remarkable given how recent. 8 days, May said. Not defensively. As information, I've been with the operation for 8 days. In that time, I identified a 7-year contract flaw that has been costing the operation money on every delayed delivery. I completed a comparative yield analysis across 12 Colorado timber operations, and I helped prepare the framework for a 30-year supply partnership. If that's the result of 8 days, I expect the 9th to be reasonably productive as well. The table had gone quieter than a table of 12 people at dinner should be. Patricia Vance looked up from her glass. Her expression had moved past the careful neutrality she had maintained since the entree, and arrived at something that resembled with reasonable precision enjoyment. Harriet reached for her wine. Well, a controlled recovery. We're all impressed by industriousness. I'm not trying to impress anyone. May kept her voice at the same register it had been since she sat down. Even. Not cold. Just accurate. I'm describing what happened. You asked about preparation. That's the answer. Catherine Hale made a small sound that she converted, not entirely successfully, into a cough. Judge Hale, who had been quiet through the meal, with the attentive stillness of a man professionally trained to listen more than he spoke, looked at May with direct interest for the first time. Mrs. Danner, I understand your family had dealings with First Territorial Bank over the past several years. We did. Fletcher Moss represented the bank's interests in those dealings. He did. And you became familiar with the bank's legal instruments through that process. Familiar enough to read them accurately. She looked at him. I understand you're on the territorial bench, Judge Hale. You've likely seen the instruments Moss uses in foreclosure proceedings. I have, he said it, without elaboration, which was itself a form of elaboration. Then you'll understand that the education those documents provide, if you read them carefully enough and often enough, is significant. May paused. I read them very carefully. I had considerable motivation. Harriet attempted 2 more angles over the course of the remaining courses. Each was met with the same quality of engagement, not deflection, not aggression. but the specific directness of someone who was answering what was actually being asked rather than what was being performed. Each time, the response produced nothing Harriet could use, which was more effective than any counterattack because it generated no heat for Harriet to redirect. After dinner, when the table had been cleared and the guests had moved to the drawing room, Harriet found a moment to appear at May's side in the configuration of apparent privacy that was actually public enough to be witnessed. "I want you to understand," Harriet said, quiet and controlled, that Boyd raised his concerns out of genuine love for this family. He only wants what's best for Cole. May looked at her. "I believe you believe that." She kept her voice at the same temperature it had been all evening. Boyd's petition to the territorial court was filed 3 months before he sent Cole the meeting invitation. The legal groundwork was built before the concern was publicly expressed. A concern that is genuine tends to be expressed before the legal infrastructure to act on it is established. She held Harriet's gaze without aggression, without triumph. "I don't say that to wound you. I say it because you are in a situation that I think you understand more clearly than Boyd does, and clarity about that situation serves you better than the version you've been given." Harriet was quiet for a moment. Her expression had moved through several positions and arrived somewhere that was not any of the things she had come to this evening, prepared to display. Patricia Vance materialized at May's other side with a glass of wine and the demeanor of someone who had timed her arrival deliberately, "Mrs. Danner. My husband wanted me to tell you that he found the yield analysis from this afternoon's meeting genuinely compelling. He's been considering timber investments in the territory for 2 years and hasn't found anyone presenting the long-term productivity data in a way that was actually useful." She handed May the wine. "He'd like to discuss it further before you leave Denver." May accepted the glass. "I'd be glad to." Harriet excused herself and did not return to that section of the room. On the carriage ride back to the Windsor, Cole said, "Harriet is not a person who forgets." "No." May looked at the Denver street outside the window. "But she's a person who calculates, and what she'll calculate when the evening settles is that continuing to pursue this costs more than stopping. You're confident of that." Boyd's legal strategy failed publicly today. His primary investor support has held for Cole. The Pratt partnership makes the operation's forward trajectory visible and credible. Harriet is defending a position that no longer has ground under it. She turned from the window. She knows that. What she doesn't know yet is whether I know she knows it. Tonight I made it clear that I do. Cole looked at her in the carriage's interior dark. "You've been doing this all your life, reading situations this way. I've been doing it since I was old enough to understand that our family's situation was being managed by people who expected us not to read it accurately." She set down the untouched wine glass on the carriage's small ledge. That expectation was their primary advantage. Once I removed it, the situation became considerably more navigable. Cole was quiet for a moment. Outside, Denver moved past the windows then. "I owe you an honest accounting of something." She waited. "When I came to Drybone Ridge, I told myself I needed a partner. Someone who could hold their own in difficult situations. Someone sharp, as I said." He was looking at his hands. The specific quality of someone choosing words for precision rather than effect. That was true. But it was also incomplete. What I needed and what I had not permitted myself to want for 4 years was someone I could trust not to leave. A pause. Sarah left because the mountain took her, not by choice. But the result was the same. I stopped building things that required another person's presence to be complete. May listened, did not move to fill the silence. What I built in the valley in 4 years is significant. It is also entirely mine in a way that makes it fragile. Not financially, the operation is sound. But a thing built by one person without anyone to question the decisions, that's a thing that becomes the shape of one person's blind spots without anyone to identify them. He looked up. "You identified 7 years of blind spot in 4 days? The Morrison clause, more than that." He held her gaze. "I built the valley as a place to survive in rather than a place to live in. I told myself those were the same thing. They're not." May looked at him. The carriage moved through the lit streets, the gas lamps making pools of yellow against the dark, the city operating with its usual indifference to the private reckonings taking place inside its vehicles. She said, "I came to the valley with a list of conditions and a bank confirmation and a calculation about which available path led somewhere rather than nowhere. That was the honest content of the decision. She paused. What I didn't calculate, because it wasn't available to calculate in advance, was what it would feel like to find work worth doing in a place worth being. I expected to manage a household. I found something I didn't have a name for until the Morrison clause. She looked at him steadily, which is the feeling of a problem that reveals itself completely when you look at it from the right angle. I've been looking for that feeling my whole life and didn't know what I was looking for. The carriage stopped at the Windsor. Neither of them moved immediately. Cole said, "When we get back to the valley, I want to formalize your role in the operation, not as a courtesy, as an accurate reflection of what the operation actually is. May, we can discuss the structure, I mean the legal structure, the operational authority, your name on the relevant documents." She looked at him. "That's a significant change, yes." He held her gaze. "It's the accurate one." She got out of the carriage. The Denver night was cold in the way of altitude cities in December, the cold carrying a different quality than the valley's cold. Less personal, less specific, the cold of a place that generated its own weather through density and activity, rather than receiving it from the mountains above. She said, before the hotel door, "Ask me again when we're home, Cole." When we're home, not a question. A confirmation of something. Judith Pratt's office at 8 in the morning had the quality of a room where real work began before the city outside had fully committed to the day. A fresh pot of coffee on the corner table, documents already active on the desk. Pratt herself standing at the wall map when May arrived, tracing a route with her finger. She did not look up immediately. "Sit, coffee's there." May poured coffee. Sat. Pratt turned from the map. "I'll be direct, because I don't have a different mode and I'm not going to develop one at this stage of my life." She sat across from May. "I have been looking for someone with your specific capacity for 3 years. I have not found them because I was looking in places that produce people with credentials rather than people with the ability to actually read a problem." May waited. "My mining operations span 3 territories: Nevada, Colorado, Wyoming. The operational side is well managed. I have good people who know how to extract ore and maintain infrastructure and manage labor. What I don't have is someone who can look at a contract structure the way you looked at the Morrison Agreement and identify where the system is losing value rather than where the individual parts seem sound." Pratt set a document on the desk between them. "I want to offer you a consulting position, specifically contract review, investor relations, and operational risk assessment for Pratt Mining. Not with your husband, yours, your name, your fee, your work." May looked at the document, a single page. The terms were on it. She read it carefully, all of it. The fee structure, quarterly, substantial, tied to identified savings rather than hours billed, which was the contract structure of someone who understood that value and time were not the same unit. The scope of work, broad enough to be meaningful, specific enough to be accountable. The term, 2 years, renewable by mutual agreement. The independence clause, her work product was hers. She reported to Pratt directly and to no one else. She read it again. Not because she had missed something the first time. Because she had learned to read twice anything she intended to sign, and she had learned that lesson too recently to abandon it for convenience. She looked up. "Nothing's wrong with these terms, Pratt." "No, the fee is above what I would have asked for. The fee reflects what the work is worth, not what you might have thought to ask for. Those are different numbers and I used the first one." Pratt looked at her. "Most people find something to negotiate even when there's nothing to negotiate. You didn't. Negotiating for the sake of appearing to negotiate is a waste of time for everyone involved." May set the document down. "I'll take the position." Pratt produced a pen and slid it across the desk. May signed. Pratt countersigned. 2 copies, 1 each. Done in the time it took to confirm what both of them had already decided before they sat down. "When Cole's operation moves into the Wyoming expansion," Pratt said, refilling her coffee, "the supply and infrastructure relationships will become more complex. You'll be working both sides of that relationship. I want you aware of that from the start." "I'm aware." "Good." Pratt set down the coffee. "There's one more thing. It's not operational." She looked at May directly. "Boyd Danner's inside source, the foreman at the Eastern operation. You know about him, Grayson?" "Yes." "His testimony to Boyd's legal team is on record. It includes specific details about Danner Timber's labor cost structure that Boyd used to build the management deviation argument." Pratt folded her hands on the desk. "If Cole pursues legal action against Grayson, which he is within his rights to do, the proceedings will be public. That creates a narrative about internal instability that Boyd can use in future filings even after losing today's challenge. May had thought about this. She had been thinking about it since Silas brought the deposition notice to the office in the valley. The alternative is to make the information Grayson provided irrelevant, not by suppressing it, by making the operation's actual conditions so thoroughly documented and publicly visible that anything Grayson said is superseded by the current record. Pratt nodded. Which is what today's meeting accomplished, in part. May looked at the window. The morning light on Blake Street, Denver going about its business below. There's a further step. The information Boyd received from Grayson was accurate as of the time it was provided. It's out of date now. The Morrison renegotiation, the Pratt partnership, the yield analysis. Those change the operational picture materially. If we publish that picture clearly and consistently, the old information doesn't just become irrelevant. It becomes evidence of how much has changed under current management. Pratt looked at her for a moment. You're describing transparency as a strategy. I'm describing accurate information made available to the people who need it in a format they can use. That's not strategy. That's what Grayson's information was a substitute for, from Boyd's perspective. Remove the need for the substitute by making the real thing available. Pratt was quiet. Then, I've been building a business argument for why your instincts are sound. You've just given me the cleaner version. She stood, extended her hand. I'll be in Dana Valley in the spring to review the supply framework on site. Have the Eastern Operations contract portfolio ready for review as well. May shook her hand. It'll be ready. She walked back to the Windsor through the December morning with the signed consulting agreement in her folio, and the specific clarity of someone who has discovered that the ground extends further than they had previously mapped. Not excitement. Excitement was a response to surprise, and May had learned through sufficient exposure to unexpected outcomes on both ends of the spectrum to not be surprised by good ones any more than bad ones. What she felt was more like the sensation of a calculation resolving cleanly. The answer was there. It was correct. She was still carrying that clarity when she reached the hotel corridor and found Cole standing outside their suite door with a telegram in his hand. His face told her before the words did. She took it from him. Read it. Earl Callum had died 4 days ago. Peacefully in his sleep, Nora at his side. The debts were cleared, the cabin was secure, Nora was managing. She was proud of her daughter in ways she did not have words for and would write a letter. She loved her. May read the telegram twice, folded it. Stood in the corridor with the weight of it settling into her body the way mountain cold settled into buildings. Not all at once, but completely, finding every available space. Cole said nothing. He did not reach for her arm or arrange his face into a shape designed to communicate sympathy at the correct register. He stood beside her in the corridor, which was its own form of language and the right one. After a moment, May said, "He read the letter I left him." "Yes, I know he did because the telegram says she's proud of me in ways she doesn't have words for. That's not her own formulation. She's telling me what he said." She folded the telegram smaller. He always had the words. She's borrowing his. She looked at the folded paper in her hand. He spent his whole life giving me his words when I needed them. I didn't know that was what he was doing until I needed them, and they were already there. Cole waited. He had learned, over the past 2 weeks, the difference between silence that avoided and silence that accompanied. He was practicing the second kind. "I'm not going back," May said. The conclusion of a calculation she had been running since she read the first line of the telegram. "He's gone. My mother has money, she has the cabin, she has time to find her footing. Going back doesn't change what's already true." She put the telegram in her coat pocket alongside the consulting agreement and the bank confirmation and the signed condition list, all the paper architecture of the decisions that had brought her here. "He told me not to look back." He meant it as instruction and as permission both. Cole said, "Do you want to go back?" May considered this honestly, which was the only way she considered anything. She wanted her father to be alive. She wanted to have seen him again. She wanted the version of the future where those things were possible. None of those things were available, which meant the wanting of them was not a sufficient basis for a decision. "No, I want to send my mother a letter that tells her everything and asks her to come to us when she's ready." She turned toward the suite door. "And I want to go home." Cole looked at her. The word home used without hesitation, without self-consciousness, without any indication that she was aware of the weight it carried in reference to a place she had known for less than 2 weeks. He received it with the care it deserved. "We leave tomorrow morning," he said. "Good." She opened the door. "And Cole?" She looked back at him. "When we're home, the legal structure of the operation. The question you said to ask you again." "Yes, ask me then. I'll have the answer." They rode back into Dana Valley on a Tuesday afternoon 12 days after they had left it, and the valley received them with the particular indifference of a place that had been operating in their absence and would continue operating after their return because it was a working thing, and working things did not pause for the convenience of individual arrivals. Silas was in the yard when they came through the lower gate. He looked at May with the specific directness of someone who had formed a question during her absence and intended to have it answered. "Grayson," he said, "is at the Eastern operation," May said. "Leave him there for now. I'll explain the reasoning when we've settled." Silas absorbed this. The Morrison renegotiation. Morrison's attorney sent a revised counterproposal this morning. I'll read it tonight. She swung down from Cinder and ran a hand along the mayor's neck. "Is the Eastern Operations contract portfolio accessible from the main office? Filed under the Eastern accounts. Why, Pratt wants it reviewed in the spring. I want to start now." Silas looked at her, then at Cole, then back at May with the expression of a man updating a significant number of his assumptions simultaneously. "I'll pull the files." Vera appeared on the lodge porch. She looked at May with the completeness of her usual appraisal and found in it whatever she had been looking for. "There's a letter from your mother," Vera said. "Arrived yesterday, and dinner is in an hour." May went to her room. The letter from Nora was on the writing desk, which meant Vera had placed it there specifically rather than leaving it on the entry table with the operational correspondence. She understood why when she read it. Nora had written 12 pages in her careful hand, the handwriting of a woman who had been taught that letters were a formal undertaking and had maintained that belief regardless of content or circumstance. The letter covered everything. Earl's last weeks, the quality of his peace in them, the morning he died and what the room was like and what Nora had said to him and what he had not said back because he was sleeping and did not wake, which was the gift of it, the clearing of the debts. The feeling of the cabin without the weight of the bank notices arriving. The neighbors who had come after Earl died, bringing food and staying to help with the practical things, which Nora had been surprised by and then unsurprised by, because she had known these people for 23 years and had simply forgotten, in the grinding of the past 5, that they were there. And at the end, 3 paragraphs about May, what Earl had said about her in the last weeks. How he had read letter 4 times that Nora knew of and probably more. What he had told Nora he hoped for, which was not happiness exactly. He was a specific man who distrusted vague wishes, but competence and purpose and someone to build something with. May sat at the writing desk and read those 3 paragraphs twice. Then she took out paper and began her reply. She wrote for 2 hours. Everything she had not had time to write in the week since they arrived in Denver, and everything she had been carrying since she left Drybone Ridge and needed to put somewhere that would hold it properly. The valley, what it looked like from the plateau, the operation and what it was and how it worked, and what she had found in the work of understanding it. Judith Pratt and the consulting position and what it meant to have her own name on a contract that had nothing to do with debt or obligation. Cole. Not extensively. She was not yet ready to write extensively about Cole to anyone, including herself, but enough. A man who signed conditions without negotiating them. A man who tells you in advance when you're going to be angry. A man who sat with her in a hotel corridor with a telegram between them and said nothing, which was the right thing. She sealed the letter. Added a line at the bottom of the envelope. "Come when you're ready. There is room." She went downstairs to dinner. The following weeks settled into a rhythm that was different from the rhythm she had found before Denver. Not because the work was different. Most of it was the same. The ledgers, the contracts, the operational questions that Silas brought to her, with the increasing frequency of someone who had discovered that bringing questions to her produced better outcomes than working around them. But the rhythm had a different quality now, like the difference between a pace you have set yourself and a pace you have found to be correct. Both are sustainable. Only one of them is right. The Morrison counter-proposal required 3 rounds of negotiation, all conducted by correspondence, all drafted by May and reviewed by Cole and Gerald Hines. The final terms were signed 6 weeks after the Denver meeting. The Clause 14B problem was eliminated. The delivery adjustment window was reduced from 10 days to 48 hours, with a mutual penalty structure that gave both parties incentive to honor the schedule. Morrison signed because the alternative had been made clear. 2 other haulers in the territory were in active discussions with Dana Timber about volume capacity, and Morrison's 20-year relationship with the operation was valuable enough to protect through a reasonable concession. The Eastern Operations contract portfolio, when May finished reviewing it, contained 4 additional problems, none as significant as the Morrison clause. 2 were minor, language that was ambiguous rather than harmful, the ambiguity creating theoretical exposure rather than demonstrated cost. 2 were real. An equipment lease agreement that included a maintenance responsibility clause that Dana Timber was not operationally positioned to fulfill and had been managing around rather than correcting. And a timber rights agreement with a property owner that had a reversion clause triggered by a change in the operation's principal ownership structure. A clause that Boyd's challenge to the estate, if it had succeeded, would have activated automatically. May brought the reversion clause finding to Cole on a Thursday evening in January, setting the agreement on the desk between them with the relevant provision marked. Cole read it. Read it again. If Boyd had won the estate petition, the timber rights on the eastern section revert to the property owner. 42 acres of the most productive second growth in that operation. How long has this clause been in the agreement? Since the original signing in 1979. Your father's operation. The estate challenge triggered it as a risk and nobody, including Boyd's attorneys, identified it in the challenge proceedings. Cole looked at the document, which means Boyd was pursuing a strategy that would have cost him what he was trying to gain. If he'd succeeded, yes, May sat across from him. He was looking at ownership, not at what ownership actually entitled him to, because he never did the work of reading what he was claiming. She paused. This needs to be renegotiated. The reversion clause needs to be removed or restructured. While we're in a position of operational strength rather than uncertainty, Gerald can initiate. He should initiate this week. And this is one of the documents I want ready for Pratt's spring review, because the eastern section supply is part of what the Wyoming expansion depends on. Cole nodded, then looked at her. You're 3 weeks ahead of where I expected the portfolio review to be. I had time. She pulled the marked document back across the desk. The Eastern operation also has a labor cost structure that's inconsistent with the Valley operation. The Eastern crews are being paid on a different scale for equivalent work. I don't know if that's intentional or inherited from your father's practices, but it's creating compression in the experienced worker tier that's going to produce turnover in the next 2 seasons. Cole was quiet for a moment. My father paid different rates at different sites depending on the site's profitability. That was his logic. I never changed it because I was focused on the safety and equipment improvements and the contract restructuring. I didn't get to labor parity. You have it now. May set the labor analysis beside the reversion clause document. These are the 2 items I'd address before spring. The contract restructuring can wait until Pratt's review because I want her to see the process rather than just the corrected result. The labor issue should be corrected before the next hiring cycle. Cole looked at the 2 documents, then at May. What made you prioritize these specifically? The reversion clause is a latent risk that becomes an active one if anything changes the ownership structure, and Boyd may try again. The labor disparity is a slow leak that doesn't look like anything urgent until the experienced workers start leaving, and you discover the replacement cost. She straightened both documents into alignment. Urgent problems announce themselves. The ones worth finding are the ones that are still quiet. Cole picked up the reversion clause analysis. Read through May's notes in the margin. Set it back down. I want to discuss the legal structure tomorrow, the operations documents. Yes. My attorney is in Denver, but Gerald can handle the initial drafting remotely. I want your name as a co-principal on the operational authority documents. Not a courtesy title. The authority that reflects what you're actually doing. May looked at him steadily. That changes how you're positioned with Boyd if he tries again. It changes how I'm positioned with everyone. Accurately, he held her gaze. You said to ask you when we were home. We're home, I'm asking. May looked at the desk. The two documents, the lamp burning in the January dark, the window with the valley invisible beyond it, the night having closed everything down to the immediate and the specific, which was, she had come to understand, exactly how she preferred to make decisions, within the actual conditions rather than the imagined ones. Yes, she said. Draw up the documents. Boyd Danner's second move arrived in February, which surprised no one who had been paying attention, because Boyd was a man who required a period of regrouping before he could accept that a position he had committed to had failed. The move was smaller than the first. A formal complaint to the Territorial Timber Licensing Authority alleging that Danner Timber's eastern operation was operating beyond the boundaries specified in its current license. A technical violation, if accurate, that would trigger an operational review and potentially a license suspension pending investigation. The complaint was filed with supporting documentation that included survey maps with markings that did not correspond to May's reading of the licensed boundaries. She spent 2 days with the actual survey documents, the original license filing, and the property records for the eastern section before she was certain the maps Boyd had filed with the complaint were altered. Not dramatically, the changes were in the boundary notations. Small adjustments of measurement that would require a survey comparison to identify, but that, if accepted at face value, would place Danner Timber's eastern harvest area 12 feet outside the licensed boundary in 2 locations. She brought the finding to Gerald Hines by telegraph and to Cole at the same time. Cole's response was what she had expected, contained. The quality of stillness under a different kind of pressure. Can you prove the maps were altered? I can demonstrate that the measurements on Boyd's filed maps are inconsistent with every other survey document in the chain of title, going back to the original license filing in 1971. The inconsistency is systematic. The same 12-foot variation appears at both boundary points, which is not how genuine survey errors occur. Survey errors are irregular. She set the 2 sets of maps side by side on the desk. This is manufactured. Gerald needs to file a formal response. Gerald needs to file a formal response that includes a request for a comparative survey conducted by a neutral third party. If the territorial authority conducts its own review using Boyd's maps as the starting point, we're in a reactive position. If we request the third-party survey, we set the standard of evidence and the review becomes ours to define rather than respond to. Cole looked at the maps. How long have you been working on this? 2 days? When did you sleep? Before and after, she pulled the maps back together. Gerald needs this today. The territorial authority has a 30-day response window and I'd like ours filed within the week. Cole sent the telegraph to Gerald. Then he looked at May with something that had been developing in his expression over the preceding weeks, and had not yet found a name either of them had applied to it. Something in the register of recognition. Not surprise, because surprise required an expectation that had been violated, and Cole had stopped having expectations about May that did not account for her full capacity some weeks earlier. What it was instead was closer to the feeling of someone who has been operating in a known space and has discovered that the space is larger than they mapped. You understood from the beginning that Boyd would move again, he said. Anyone with the psychology he's demonstrated moves again. Losing doesn't revise the conviction that they're owed something. It revises the method. She looked at him. That's why the Eastern contract portfolio needed to be clean before spring. Every exposure he identifies is a potential filing. If the portfolio is clean, his options narrow. You've been preparing for his next move while we were dealing with his last one. That's how you deal with a person who is committed to a long campaign. She looked at the maps. Moss did the same thing. Each visit was preparation for the next one. You had to be as far ahead of him as he was ahead of you. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, Boyd won't stop at 2 moves. No, but each move he makes requires resources. Legals, staff time, his own credibility with the people he needs to support the next filing. After 2 failed moves, the third one costs him more than it costs us, because we've established a pattern of response that makes the next one predictable. He's not just losing each individual challenge. He's building a record of failed challenges that will eventually make it impossible to find anyone willing to support the next one. Cole looked at her. The deposition notice? Grayson. You said we shouldn't act before the Denver meeting because confronting him would signal to Boyd that we knew. We're past the Denver meeting. Yes, May looked at the window. The February valley outside, snow on everything. The operation running in the specific reduced rhythm of deep winter. Grayson needs to be moved. Not terminated, that creates a wrongful dismissal risk and gives Boyd another filing. Moved to a different role, one with less access to the contract and financial structures. She paused and offered a clear choice. His cooperation in documenting what he provided to Boyd voluntarily in exchange for continued employment in the reassigned role. If he cooperates, we have evidence of Boyd's solicitation of internal information. If he refuses, we proceed with the role change regardless and the documentation of the separation. If he cooperates, that becomes evidence in any future proceedings. Yes. Boyd's next move after the survey complaint will be another estate challenge or a direct suit claiming operational damages. Either way, evidence that he corrupted an employee to build his case changes the character of the proceedings significantly. Cole was quiet for longer than his usual quiet, the kind of quiet that was not processing but something else, the specific pause of someone who is arriving at a perception they have been moving toward for some time and are now completing. May. He said her name the way he had been saying it for the past several weeks, not as an address but as a word that had weight separate from its function. You came to Drybone Ridge with a list of conditions and a calculation. I came to you with a bank draft and a set of reasons I wasn't prepared to explain. She looked at him. Yes, what are you prepared to explain now? About where we are. It was not quite the question she had expected, which was why it was the right one. Not a declaration in search of a mirror, an actual question, open-ended. Genuinely asking, May looked at her hands on the desk, the calluses from the fence post years still there, the ink stain on her right index finger from 2 days of map analysis. The hands of someone who had been working. I came here to survive a situation, she said. I stayed because the work was worth doing and the place was worth understanding. She stopped. Started from a different place. I have not been honest with myself about the rate at which this has become something I would not leave. She looked up at him. Which is fast. Considerably faster than is comfortable to admit, Cole said. Why uncomfortable? Because I came here with conditions. And conditions imply the possibility of a different outcome than the one you're currently hoping for. Admitting that I'm hoping for a specific outcome removes the protection of the conditions. She looked at him steadily. I'm aware that's not rational. The conditions were signed. They stand regardless of my hoping. But there is a difference between compliance and investment, and I have been pretending for several weeks that I'm in the first category when I'm clearly in the second. Cole was quiet. Then, when I sent the message to Vera before I went to Drybone Ridge, before I knew what your answer would be, she asked me why I was certain enough to have the room prepared. What did you tell her? I told her I wasn't certain about the answer. I was certain about my intention. He looked at her directly. I had not been certain about an intention involving another person for 4 years. The certainty itself was the information. May looked at him. The desk between them, the maps and contracts and documents that were the daily architecture of what they had been building. The lamp burning in the February dark, she said. I read the same map twice before I trust it. Cole, I know, this is the second reading. He stood. Crossed from his side of the desk to hers, which was a distance of 8 feet and also considerably more than that, and the crossing of it was not impulsive. It was the movement of someone who has been certain of their intention for long enough to act on it without the action being a surprise to anyone, including himself. He stood beside her, not reaching for her. Present, close enough that the question was available. May stood, turned to face him. The lamp throwing its light across both of them, the valley outside in its winter dark, the operation quiet around them, she said. Ask Vera to keep the lock on the door if it makes her feel better. I won't be using it. Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he took her face in both hands and kissed her. Not the brief formal contact of two people managing a situation, but the real thing, full and certain, the kind that arrives after sufficient evidence has been gathered and the conclusion is sound. When they separated, May said, "The Grayson conversation should happen this week." Cole made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Tomorrow, good." She picked up the maps, "and the survey request needs to go to Gerald tonight." Tonight. He was still looking at her with the expression that had not yet acquired a name, but that she was beginning to understand was simply what Cole Danner's face did when it had stopped managing itself for the benefit of other people's comfort. She handed him the maps. Then go write the telegraph. I'll finish the analysis. He took the maps, did not move immediately. Then, May, she looked up. I spent 4 years building something that would outlast me. I did not consider that it might be improved by someone who could see what I couldn't. He held the maps. I should have considered it sooner. She looked at him. You found me at the right time, not the convenient time. The right one. She turned back to the desk. Now go write the telegraph, he went. Spring came to Dana Valley with the specific conviction of a season that has been delayed long enough to have accumulated momentum. The snow on the lower slopes retreated in the first 2 weeks of April, revealing the ground beneath in the state it was always in after winter, changed, settled into its new configuration by the weight of what had been on top of it. Different from November in ways that required relearning, May Callum arrived on the 14th of April. She came the way May had come, on horseback with one bag. May met her at the crossroads at the bottom of the Drybone Ridge Road with Cinder and a second horse, and the specific feeling of someone who has been waiting for something and has become uncertain, in the waiting, whether the thing will arrive as imagined. Nora arrived as herself, which was exactly as imagined and entirely a relief. She rode up through the pass without complaint, which meant she was either tougher than the past 5 years had allowed her to appear, or she had decided that complaint was not available to her on this particular journey. May suspected both. At the plateau, when the valley revealed itself below, Nora stopped her horse and looked for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Your father would have wanted a week to look at every detail and ask who built what, and whether it was done right. It was done right." May looked at the valley. "Most of it, that's the honest answer." Nora looked at her. He would have liked the honest answer. They rode down. Cole met them at the compound gate. He had not prepared remarks or a particular expression. He was simply there, which was what he was, and he took Nora's horse's bridle while she dismounted and said, "Mrs. Callum, you're welcome here." And Nora looked at him with the assessment she had been applying to things for 59 years, reading character through the small gestures rather than the large ones, through the quality of attention a person brought to whatever was directly in front of them. She said, "My husband would have had opinions about your timber practices?" "Cole? What kind of opinions?" "Practical ones. He managed land his whole life. He understood extraction." She handed him the reins. "He also understood that the land remembers what you do to it." Cole looked at her. "Yes, it does." Vera appeared on the porch, looked at Nora, looked at May, made the adjustment in her expression that indicated a conclusion she had been anticipating had arrived in the form expected. She said, "Come inside. There's food and a room ready, and I expect you'll want to see the library." "Nora, there's a library," Vera. "Built one over the winter, reorganized the existing collection and expanded it." "I understand you were a reader." May watched her mother follow Vera into the lodge and felt the quality of a thing settling into place that had been suspended for exactly the right duration. Not too long, long enough. Boyd Dana's survey complaint had been dismissed in March by the Territorial Licensing Authority. The authority, upon receiving the complaint, had followed its standard procedure for boundary disputes, commissioning an independent survey conducted by a licensed territorial surveyor unconnected to either party. This was the process May had anticipated when she filed Gerald Hines's formal response, requesting precisely that procedure, knowing that standard process would serve their interests better than any argument they could make directly. The independent survey confirmed the boundary measurements in the original license filing and found the notations in Boyd's filed maps to be inconsistent with every other document in the chain of title going back to the original license filing in 1871. The authority's written determination used the word discrepancies 11 times across its 4 pages, which was the language of bureaucratic precision doing the work that more direct language was not available to it. Grayson, when Silas approached him in February, 3 weeks after Boyd's Denver challenge had failed publicly and 1 week after the survey complaint had been filed, giving Grayson sufficient time to understand the shape of how things were going, had asked for a day to think about it. Silas had given him the day without pressure, which was part of May's instruction. A man making a transaction needed to feel that the terms were his to accept rather than forced upon him, even when the alternatives were limited. The following morning, Grayson had come to Silas's office, not the other way around, and said he wanted to cooperate. His account documented 3 things. The approach Boyd had made through an intermediary at a Glenwood Springs saloon 14 months prior. The specific promise Boyd had extended, a senior management role at wages above what Grayson currently earned, contingent on a successful estate challenge, and the exact information Grayson had provided and when. The account was notarized and filed with Gerald Hines. Grayson was moved to a role managing equipment maintenance at the Eastern site, with wages equivalent to his previous position and no access to contract or financial documents. He had accepted this without objection, which confirmed May's reading of his motivation. He had made a transaction with Boyd based on what Boyd was offering, not based on loyalty or ideology, and when the transaction failed, he had no remaining stake in the association. Boyd made no third move, not that spring, not that summer in June. Gerald received a letter from Boyd's legal representative, indicating that Boyd was withdrawing all outstanding challenges and had no intention of filing further proceedings. The letter offered no explanation beyond the formal language of withdrawal. Gerald said the explanation was self-evident to anyone who had watched the preceding 8 months. The Eastern Operations reversion clause had been renegotiated in March. The property owner, presented with a restructured agreement that removed the reversion trigger and replaced it with a first right of purchase provision in the event of ownership change, had accepted within a week. He had not been aware the reversion clause was there. He was glad to have a cleaner agreement. The labor parity corrections at the Eastern operation went into effect at the start of the spring hiring cycle. 3 workers who had been moving toward departure renewed their contracts. The turnover May had projected did not materialize. Judith Pratt arrived in Dana Valley in the 2nd week of May, accompanied by 2 of her own operational staff and surveying equipment for the supply route mapping. She spent 4 days in the valley and 2 days at the Eastern operation and said less during that time than most people said in 4 hours, because she was a person who collected information in the field rather than produced it. On the last evening, she sat with May at the main table in the lodge office while Cole was with Silas reviewing the summer harvest plan. Pratt said, "The Eastern portfolio clean. The 2 real problems have been addressed. I'll send you the final documentation next week." Good. Pratt looked at the maps spread between them. The supply framework is going to require more volume than we originally projected. The Wyoming expansion is moving faster than my team anticipated. I need to talk to Cole about capacity, but I wanted to ask you first. May looked at the yield projections. The valley operation can increase volume by approximately 8% without affecting the long-term harvest model. The Eastern operation has more flexibility, up to 15% in the second growth sections without degrading the 40-year projection. She paused. But I'd want to see the Wyoming expansion timeline before committing to specific numbers. Early-stage construction timber and mid-stage infrastructure timber are different specifications. The volume commitment needs to match the demand curve. Pratt looked at her. I have the expansion timeline in Denver. Then this conversation should happen in Denver. Or you send me the timeline and I run the numbers here, and we finalize the terms by correspondence. Correspondence is faster. Pratt pulled a document from her folio. One other item. I want to expand the consulting arrangement. May looked at the revised agreement. The scope extended to include Wyoming expansion planning, supply chain coordination between Pratt Mining and Dana Timber, and regulatory review for the Wyoming licensing applications. She read it carefully, found the terms consistent with the original agreement's structure and philosophy. Signed on the afternoon Pratt's party left the valley. May stood on the lodge porch and watched the supply road below until the horses were out of sight. The May afternoon was clear in the way that high altitude produces when the winter's accumulated haze has finally cleared and the air is simply itself. The mountains on all sides in full light, the compound operating below with the sound of work that needed doing being done. Cole came and stood beside her. She said, "The Wyoming regulatory review starts when the draft applications arrive in June." "I know," Pratt told me. "It'll take most of my time through September." Yes, he looked at the mountains. The valley operation will manage. Silas has enough authority now to handle the summer season. May looked at the compound. At the operation her husband's father had built and her husband had rebuilt and she had been part of for 5 months. At the accumulated evidence of those 5 months, The corrected contracts, the labor parity, the survey record, the Eastern portfolio, the Pratt agreement, the work of what had been done because it needed doing. She said, "When I read the letter Vera left for me, the first one, the telegram in Denver, I thought about the fence posts." Cole looked at her. "My father said a fence is just a line in the ground. That what matters is what you're protecting." She looked at the mountains. The valley below them, held in its hollow between the ridges, the same geography that had concealed it for longer than anyone currently living had been counting. I understand now that he wasn't only talking about the Callum property. He was telling me how to think about everything. What you build it around. Whether the thing at the center is worth the work of the perimeter. Cole was quiet. "This is," she said, simply. "Not the performance of conviction, but the conclusion of it. What's here? The operation, the work, the people who depend on it. You," she looked at him, "worth the perimeter, worth the building." Cole looked at her, the expression that had found its name in January. On an evening in this office with documents between them and a lamp burning and a decision made. Simply what his face did when it had stopped managing itself for anyone's comfort, when the person beside him had earned the unguarded version of his attention and he had decided to give it without reservation. He said, "Ask me in 10 years." She understood what he meant. Ask him then whether it had been worth it. Not because he doubted it now, but because worth was not a conclusion that honest people drew from 5 months of evidence. It was a conclusion you drew from a decade, from the winters and the disagreements and the bad seasons and the problems that arrived without warning and the work of meeting them together and continuing. 10 years, she said. "I'll ask you then." Below them the valley worked in the May light. Cole's hand found hers at her side, not reaching, simply finding, the way people who have learned each other's positions in space do without thinking about it. She turned her hand over, held his 4 months along now. Not yet visible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, though Vera had known since March with the specific certainty of a woman who had been paying attention to this household for 11 years and did not miss things. Eliza Nora Dana. A name they had agreed on in February on a cold evening when the snow was still deep on the lower slopes and the valley was sealed, and there was nothing to do but be present with each other and the fire and the future they were building toward. Eliza for Cole's mother, the woman who had taught him what it looked like to be kind in a house that did not always make kindness easy. Nora for the woman who was currently inside the lodge arguing with Vera about the most efficient configuration for the expanded library shelving, which was a disagreement both of them were clearly enjoying more than they were interested in resolving. The fence posts were in the ground, the thing at the center was worth them, and the morning would come again, as mornings did in this valley, clarifying rather than warming, revealing the shape of things rather than softening them. May had learned to prefer that quality of light. It showed you what was actually there, and what was actually there, she had concluded through 5 months of evidence and the particular discipline of a woman who did not draw conclusions without it, was worth every fence post her father had ever driven into Colorado ground.